Generative linguistics has several subfields, and we started with semantics, which is its way of dealing with questions of meaning. And we saw it was highly abstract. And we saw that there was another approach to meaning, which is pragmatics, which doesn't assume the same kind of abstract view of language. And then we got to syntax, which is pure abstraction. It's all about rules that affect which sequences of words are determined to lie within the system, called English or French, and which are not within the system. Now we're going to move down one more level, down to the level of sound. Here again, we'll find generative linguistics has an approach to sound which is highly abstract and theoretical. And we'll find that there's another approach to sound which is not highly abstract and theoretical. So one lies within generative linguistics and one lies outside it. Phonology is the branch of generative linguistics that deals with sound, and phonetics is the approach to the sounds of speech which is not necessarily bound by generative linguistics. So what are we dealing with in phonology? Remember, in syntax we were looking at which sequences of words are permissible. Well, we'll find something similar in phonology, except it won't be words that we're interested in sequencing, it will be sounds. And it turns out that in any given language, English, French, Dutch, some sequences of sounds are perfectly fine, and some sequences of sounds are not. It's a lot like being grammatical. It's not quite the same thing, but it's very similar. So phonology is concerned with uncovering the rules that determine which sequences of sounds are permissible and how sounds interact as they are sequenced. So, for example, we could make up an entirely new English word. I'm going to make one up. Oh, we've got 4 possible ones here. We've got scraw, stlump, pfff, and poink. What I'd like you to do is to take a moment to think, are they all possible English words? Supposing we need a new word. I've just invented something and now we need a new word. Could we call it a scraw? In my view, that one's perfectly fine. It fits in. Stlump, on the other hand, is kind of difficult to say. And that sequence of sounds at the start, stl, doesn't occur in English. Never occurs in English. There's no English word that begins with stl, stl. So that one, to my intuition, looks wrong. You may feel differently. Pfff is much easier to say. There's also no English word that begins with pf, so it might be just as bad as slump, but somehow it doesn't feel quite as bad to me. I'm just giving you my intuitions. Pfiff is actually a word in German, and the pf cluster in German often goes along with words in English that begin with just P. So pipe, for example, the thing you smoke, a pipe, is a Pfeife with a PF in German. So pfiff is also kind of illegal, like stlump doesn't look right, but it's not quite as bad. Poink looks like it's fine, like scrawl looks like it's fine, but scrawl seems more familiar than poink. Poink seems a little bit artificial. To me, poink seems artificial. You form your own view here. Scrawl looks like it has rhymes with words like thaw and flaw, for example. The scr at the start we find in scratch and scream. So it has lots of near neighbours. Poink doesn't really have many near neighbours. Oink, the funny sound a pig makes, and perhaps boink is a word. I don't know. I'll leave that one up to you. It's kind of if it's a word, it's a lonely word. It doesn't have many relatives. So you can see that some sequences of sounds are absolutely fine. Some sequences of sounds are absolutely not fine. And we might be called upon to make some judgments here as to what's acceptable and what's not. That's a lot like what goes on in syntax, where we look at which sequences of words are fine, and we're called on to make judgments as to whether something is grammatical or not. Now, the rules in phonology that determine legal combinations of sounds are called phonotactic rules. And the things that are sequenced, we've just been calling them sounds. They have a technical name in phonology. They're called phonemes. And it's an assumption, a theoretical assumption, which might turn out to be useful, might turn out to be not useful. The theoretical assumption is that any given language, English, Dutch, French, Marathi, whatever, has available a small, relatively small set of sounds, a set of phonemes, and that all the words in the language will be made by combining these particular phonemes in accordance with phonotactic rules. And phonemes are a lot like letters. That's not an accident. They're also not the same thing as letters. Phonemes are hypothetical, abstract sound units that are being sequenced as I'm speaking. There's no letters involved when I'm speaking. When writing systems were developed, and they developed in many ways in different places, and they took different forms, one of the most wildly successful of these innovative forms was the alphabetic writing system, which came from the Phoenicians through the Greeks and has a long history. And in this system, basically letters correspond to the intuitions of speakers about the sounds that they are sequencing. In many languages, then, if we go and consider what are the phonemes of this language, we find that they correspond more or less to letters, so that the letters give you an indication of which sounds are being sequenced. Some languages have complicated histories, and the mapping between phonemes and sounds, phonemes and letters, is more complicated. And English is an unholy disaster here. English, of all the world's languages, has by far the most complicated relation of its alphabetic writing system to the sounds of the language. You know how disastrously bad English spelling is. A word ending in O-U-G-H, for example. How should that be? Is it going to be pronounced with an F, like in enough? Or an oof, like in cough? English spelling is a disaster, and you're all familiar with this. This is quite unique among the world's languages. It is by far the worst one. And this is one more case where English, which has attracted most attention, also turns out to be, in many respects, a completely unique and weird language. So we shouldn't take English as our central example of language. The reason English spelling is so bad is, of course, because of the history of the British Empire, which extended around the entire globe, and there was trade relations and all kinds of relations with people from all over the earth, and languages get mixed up, so words are borrowed. English contains words from Irish, it contains words from Swahili, it contains words from Russian. So this historical spread of the British Empire is the reason that English spelling is so desperately bad. So if you're in this game of phonology, what kind of things do you do, apart from identifying phonemes and identifying legal combinations of sounds? I'll give you an example of the kind of homework you might get. You won't get it in this module, but if you were taking a phonology class, you might get a puzzle like this. We're going to look at English, and we're going to notice that in English, when we form a plural, we add a morpheme, as we've seen, to the end of a word. So we can ask, what's the sound of that? What are the sound or sounds in that morpheme? Well, let's have a look. Here's a list of words. Lip, lips. That's the plural. Lips. S, s, s. So it's an S-like sound. S. Grand. So maybe the phoneme that's appropriate to the plural marker in English is S. That's often has a correspondence in spelling, of course. We often write the letter S to form a plural, but we're interested here in sounds, not in letters. So lip has a S-like sound at the end. What about rock? Rocks. S, s. Yep. Rocks. S, s, s. Sounds like the same sound, so we're going well here. What about tree? Tree. Trees. The plural of tree is trees. Can you see how that sound is different? Zzz is like a Z sound. It's a buzzy sound. Zzz. Technically, we say it's voiced, whereas the S sound, s, is just a pure hiss with no laryngeal content, no vibration down here. So now we've got two different ways that the plural marker can appear. S, lips, s, rocks, z, tree. Here's another word, latch. The plural is latches. Here's a third one, is. Is not the same thing as z, which is not the same thing as s. So latch adds z, which is like a vowel and a buzzy Z-like sound. And we can go through the rest, and you can do this as an exercise, and you'll find that there's three. To form a plural in English, you must somehow choose from among three options, s, z, or is. And funnily enough, if you're a competent speaker of the language, you may not have realized that there's three plural forms, but you kind of know that there's three plural forms, because if I give you a word that you've never seen before, or never seen in the plural before, you will have no difficulty in creating a plural. So we invented a word there in the last slide, scraw. What's the plural of scraw, supposing it's a noun? Scraws. It's going to have the Z-like plural. You know it would sound wrong if you went scross or scraws. Scraws. The Z-like plural fits here. So, as a competent speaker, here you are creatively generating a plural for a word you've never seen, and you know which of these three options to pick. That tells us there's some regularity underlying here, which speakers of the language have, as it were, internalized. And so the kind of exercise a phonologist would do is to try to look and see what's the nature of this rule, this assumed regularity. Which words are going to take a s, which are going to take a z, and which are going to take an z. Now, we're not going to go into the detail of the solution. A full answer to this will look at the sounds that occur in the word before it's made plural, and it will look at the final sound, and it will look at where that's made in the mouth. So p, lips, is made here at the lips, oddly enough. Rock is made at the back, k, a K-like sound at the back, k. Latch is made at the top of the mouth. Tree has a vowel at the end. And we'd look at all this, and for example, if it has a vowel at the end, we'll find it's always the z. And that's why scraw becomes scraws. The details needn't concern us, but this is an idea of the kind of exercise you might find yourself doing in a phonology class. If you're interested, here's one more, which we're not going to solve. We'll just look at the nature of the question. In Ireland, any of these words might appear: pure, cute, tune, abuse, dues, argue, muse. They all have this U sound in them. Well, if we go over to New York, we'd be in a city called New York, not New York. In Ireland, we use the word new, but if you go to New York, they say new. We say new, they say new. That's kind of odd. And then you might find other examples. So we say tune, for example. That's a nice tune you're playing there. In New York, that's a tune. Funny how they speak in New York, isn't it? They have tunes. So sometimes when we have you in Ireland, New Yorkers have oo. But sometimes when we have you in Ireland, New Yorkers also have you. So the word muse, for example, might be spoken in New York or in Dublin, and in both cases it would be pronounced muse. It's not the case that in New York they say moose. That's the sound a cow makes. So that tells us there must be something underlying this. There must be some way to describe which words are going to be different on both sides of the Atlantic and which are not. Now the answer here is again going to be complicated, and I've put a sketch of the answer there if you're interested in following this up. But I want you more to see that this is a game of spotting regularities and then trying to express those as rules in order to understand what it is that native speakers know without knowing that they know it. So it's a rather abstract enterprise. These phonemes are abstract things that we hypothesize exist. They're not uncontroversial. Some people like phonemes. Some people say phonemes are there's an oversimplification. But they prove very useful in this kind of exercise. They're hypothetical sort of sound atoms. And the assumption that generative linguistics is working with is that there's a system, French, English, Dutch, we call it L, a language, and that it has a small finite set of contrasting phonemes, both consonants and vowels, and that these are the building blocks from which then the meaning-making units are going to be built, the morphemes. So you can see how this slots right in here to the generative linguistic framework, semantics, syntax, morphology, and phonology. It's abstract, it's theoretical, it's not concerned with sound produced in any particular context or text that serves any particular purpose, and it assumes that there is a well-defined system which competent speakers somehow know or have internalized. That's all a theoretical view of language, which reveals some things, but it doesn't exhaust the meaning of language. So it's important to know what generative linguistics is and what it's not. So this is how generative linguistics treats sound, and now we're going to look at phonetics, which also treats of sound, but is not within generative linguistics. It's part of linguistics. Broadly construed, phonetics is simply the study of speech. Its production and its perception and its transmission, everything to do with speech. Notice that generative linguistics didn't really care whether those abstract units came out as speech sounds or were written down as letters. Phonetics is solely concerned with speech. So language is not the same thing as speech, although there's a huge overlap. Generative linguistics is concerned with an abstract notion of language. Speech is the concern of phonetics, and it's the things it looks at and its methods and its questions are quite different from phonology, which also, in a sense, dealt with sound. It dealt with an abstract view of sound. There's nothing abstract about phonetics. In phonetics, we take microphones and we record sound pressure variation, and we play things to people and see can they hear them. And we deal with the physics of the body. We look at the larynx and we look at the lungs, all of which are involved in speaking. So they're quite different, even though they both deal with sound. Please don't confuse these two. Phonetics deals with sound, meat, spit, ears. Phonology deals with these abstract symbolic units called phonemes, assumed to be combined according to formal rules. Quite different enterprises. In both cases, they're interested in how some abstract notion of language manifests in the form of speech. But phoneticians are not necessarily only interested in the kind of things that generative linguists are interested in. So here, for example, is some very interesting work in phonetics in which we can use modern MRI imaging techniques to observe the movements of the tongue and the parts of the mouth while speaking. This is not X-ray, mind you. An X-ray at this dosage would kill you. This is very modern MRI technology. Let's have a look at this.
Welcome to the Science Gallery of the Max Planck Society.
Do you see that tongue moving in there? It's big and horrible. Look at it. Your tongue is much bigger than the little bit that you see when it sticks out. Phoneticians are really interested in the tongue and how big it is and how you can move it. So there we go. Phonetics is the production and perception of speech in its physical manifestation as sound. And we have interests in, I'm a phonetician, I better admit that here. We're interested in the anatomy and physiology of speaking and hearing. And it's a very empirical discipline. We go out and stick microphones in people's faces and we make recordings and we measure things. Phonology belongs in generative linguistics, and there's not much to measure there. There's nothing to record. It's concerned with thinking about abstract systems on the assumption that there are these hypothetical units called phonemes. And its main interest is in uncovering systematic regularities, as it were, rules. You can see it's very similar to syntax with its concentration on rules. So there we go. We've been through the four disciplines of generative linguistics: semantics, syntax, morphology, and phonology. And you should see that they belong together. And they form one view of the broad topic of language, one which emerged after the Second World War, and which does by no means cover all that we want to talk about language. Sometimes this is mistaken for the study of everything to do with language, and it's not. It's a very specific way of coming at language. And we saw At the top of that, semantics deals with meaning, but we can deal with meaning in a way that's not within generative linguistics, and we saw that in pragmatics. Phonology is generative linguistics' way of dealing with sound, but we saw phonetics has a very different approach to sound. It is not within generative linguistics. So I hope that clarifies what generative linguistics is and isn't, and we move on to consider many other topics in the study of language. It's an enormously rich topic.